Thank you, Jamie. It is good to see everybody here. The folks that did not go anywhere for fall break, these are my people, right? Fall break comes around, you're just grinding. No, don't make any difference to you. I know some of you are getting back from fall break. Others, my phone's been blowing up this morning. People sending me pictures from the beach that are getting ready to watch the live stream. So if you're watching and you're at the beach, hope it rains every day. No, I do not hope that, but hope you have a great time. Now, I want you to imagine that tomorrow morning you woke up only to discover that through a nearly unbelievable set of circumstances overnight, you had become rich. Now, I don't have time to explain how it happened, just that it happened. And now maybe for the first time in your life, you wake up and you are wealthy. What would you do first? Where would you go? Who would you call? What kind of trip would you plan? What would you buy? What would you upgrade? Now, for some of you, those are easy questions because you already spent a lot of time thinking about, if I had money, here's what I'd do. Other people, you gave up on that a long time ago, so you haven't thought much about it recently, but let's just pretend that was the case. Or let's take it a step further. Let's say instead of it happening tomorrow, let's just pretend that it happened today. How would you react if you suddenly discovered that you were rich and unbeknownst to you, you'd actually been rich for a long time already? Would that be good news or would that be bad news? Now you hear that question like, well, of course that would be good news. That's the kind of news I've spent my life waiting on. Of course that'd be good news. But other people would tell you maybe it's not so good. Maybe instead of being the best thing that ever happened to you, being rich might actually create a whole new set of problems for you. Now, if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to 1 Timothy chapter 6. And this morning, we're in week 5 of a series that we're calling Chasing Mirages. And the idea behind it is at different points throughout our lives, there are these things that we think that we need to be happy or to feel fulfilled or whatever it is. And it's like, so we spend our time chasing them only to find that they're always over the next horizon. They're always around the next corner. They're never quite in our grasp. And the one we're going to talk about today is one that affects all of us. When you're young, you dream about it. When you're middle-aged, you chase it. And when you get older, you either spend a lot of time trying to manage it or you spend time worrying that you don't have enough of it. Now, if you've been with us over these last few weeks, we've talked about some really profound ideas. And I hope you've spent some time reflecting on them. The first one that we talked about was that winning is better than losing. Now, I know that's deep, and you have to kind of think about that, but winning's better than losing. That's why you spend so much of your time trying to win. Then last week, we talked about this idea that being happy is better than being unhappy. And again, at the risk of moving too fast, I want to push past that one and go to another one. It's this: having enough is better than not having enough. Now, you know that's true. Doesn't matter what you talk about. I mean, you could use anything. For example, having enough water is better than not having enough water. Having enough food is better than not having enough food. Having enough clothes to wear is better than not having enough clothes. And, of course, there's the big one. Having enough money to pay your bills and meet your needs and take care of your family is better than not having enough money. Everybody knows that. If you ever found yourself in a tight spot, you come to the end of the month and you realize it's going to be tight. Don't know if I can pay the bills. Don't know if I can make the ends meet. Then you have felt the weight of potentially not having enough money. The problem, though, is that for most of us, we've convinced ourselves that because that statement's true, there's another statement that must also be true that goes like this. If having enough is better than not having enough, then it only makes sense that having more than enough would be better than just having enough. And so here's what we do. Since we believe that deep inside, we will spend a big part of our lives dreaming about, planning for, strategizing over, working toward not just having enough, but trying to get more than enough. And what if our never-ending pursuit of more than enough is actually creating more problems than it's solving. So what you find, 1 Timothy chapter 6, the last part of a letter written by an early church leader named Paul to a younger associate of his named Timothy. As he wrote this letter, Paul was in prison trying to figure out whether he was going to live or die, while Timothy is in a place called Ephesus trying to lead a church. I've got a picture of this huge theater that was in Ephesus, kind of this imposing structure, one of the most famous structures in the ancient world. That's where Timothy was. That was the city. And historians tell us that the population of Ephesus was 250,000 at the time that Timothy was there, and it was divided into two groups of people. We might call them the haves and the have-nots, but in that day and age, it was the merchant class and the slaves. Now, there were obviously more slaves than there were members of the merchant class, but every Sunday when Timothy gathered with his congregation and he looked out over the people that made up his little church, he saw people that were living on both extremes of the socioeconomic scale. You had a lot of people who were just barely getting by, sort of substandard living. On the other side, you had people who were living lives of luxury, at least by first century standards, and they've all come together to create this one little church, and Timothy is the preacher. So Paul, understanding the unique challenge that Timothy's facing, writes this letter, and right towards the end of it, right before he closes the letter, he takes some time to remind Timothy and his hearers of something that most of us, I'm afraid, have forgotten. And that's that having more than enough can actually be dangerous, because there are some side effects that come with that. Now, when you get down to the end of 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul's going to identify the side effects of wealth. Now, sometimes if you're watching television, especially if you're watching one of those late night football games, I'm sorry to bring that up, but if you're watching one of those late night football games, it's not unusual for there to be a commercial for some miracle drug. You're going to grow thicker hair, or you're going to lose 10 pounds, or your blood pressure is going to drop. And they go through this commercial and they spend 99% of the time telling you how great this thing is. And then right at the end of the commercial, either on the screen for just a split second, or they'll speed up the voice of some narrator, it'll say something like this: warning, use of this drug may cause hallucinations, memory loss, blood clots, certain types of cancer, thoughts of suicide, and or sudden death due to cardiac event. And you hear that and you think, man, I just wanted some thicker hair. You know what I mean? I'm not sure it's worth all that. Well, Paul says it's kind of like that when it comes to wealth. There's some good things about it, but there's also some dangerous side effects that you need to be on your guard against. But before we jump into this, there's one thing I want to make sure you understand. We talked about it last weekend a little bit, so if you were here last weekend, you already know where I'm going with this. And here's the deal. Most of us are already rich. And here's what I mean by that. I showed you this chart. I'm going to show it again just so you know I'm not making this up. This is from the World Bank. It says if you have an annual income of just $35,000, that puts you in the top 4% of wage earners in the world. $35,000. Some of you went home and checked that and found out that I was right. Because you hear that and you think, that cannot be true. But the truth is, if you have an annual income of $35,000, that's 12.4 times more than the global median income, which is just over $3,000. So another way to think about it is like this. If you go home today and you've got like clothes in your closet that you never wear, and you've got food in your refrigerator that you know you're not going to eat because you're going to eat this other food, and if you ever go home in the middle of the week after a long day at work and there are like boxes from Amazon, piled up on your porch, then you're one of the rich people. I know you may not feel that way. It may not always look that way, but by every standard, by every economic measurement, we live in the richest country in the world at the richest time in history. So when Paul is writing these warnings to rich people, he's not talking about, the billionaires that live on private islands and fly around in helicopters. He's talking about us, because we're the top 4%. Now, with that in mind, I want you to listen to what he says. 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting in verse 6. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Now, if you're keeping track, there are 4 side effects of wealth that Paul mentions. And here's the first one. It's greed. And what is greed? Paul describes it as this insatiable desire for more. So you look at verse 8, Paul describes a person who on one level has everything they need. They've got clothes to wear, they've got food to eat, but so from that angle, life's pretty good, but that's not enough, because you get to verse 9, it becomes clear that for them, having enough is not enough. They want more than enough. So what do? They set off in pursuit of more, and in doing so, more often than not, they fall into a trap. Maybe they make a bad investment that turns out to be too good to be true. Maybe they take on excessive debt because they see there's some huge opportunity, only to watch the economy slow down and business bottom out. Or maybe they get involved in some kind of illegal scheme, and instead of making more, they wind up losing everything they have. Just this week, I was reading in the paper, a well-respected financial advisor in Ohio sentenced to 22 years in federal prison for operating what turned out to be a Ponzi scheme, stole $10 million from his investors over a 3-year period. What was so crazy about it, you read the article, and buried in one line near the end, they mentioned that his net worth before the scheme was already over $10 million. You think, why would you do that? The Herald Leader this week, there was a story of a 70-year-old Central Kentucky coroner who was sentenced to 1 year of house arrest and 5 years probation for his part in a scheme that stole weapons and ammunition from the state police and sold them to private citizens 1 year before his retirement. So why would you do that? Why would you risk that? By his own admission, he said he saw it as an easy way to make a little extra money. That's what greed does. It's like a drug. You get a little bit, and all you can think about is how much better your life would be if you just had a little bit more. And so like an addict chases the next high, you're always chasing the next dollar. Here's the second side effect that Paul talks about, and that's distractions. You get down to verse 10. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and have pierced themselves with many griefs. Now that word wander means to drift or to walk away without any clear sense of purpose, without any sense of direction. So most of the time you don't wander somewhere on purpose. You're just sort of walking and something catches your eye and you begin to wander toward that thing, and then something else catches your eye and you wander back toward that other thing, but there's no real sense of purpose. There's no real sense of direction. And behind all of that, Paul says that when you become eager for money, when you become greedy, you can get distracted by all kinds of other things at the expense of the most important things. So maybe it's a business opportunity, maybe it's just the time it takes to manage what you already have, or maybe it's just all the stuff that comes with being successful. So the trips, the invitations, the toys. I mean, if you're not careful, Paul says those things can become a recipe for ruin and destruction. And you've probably known people that's happened to. Now, you skip down to verse 17. Paul picks up the same thing, and he tells us about two more potential side effects that can come with having too much. Check out what he says. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. So here's the third side effect, and that's arrogance. And it's weird how this works, but have you ever noticed, like, don't look at them like if they're here, you know what I mean? But have you ever noticed how as a person's net worth goes up, their sense of self-worth can go up too? Even those two things are not necessarily connected. It's hard to explain. The other thing that can sometimes happen, especially if we're not careful, is that we can start to believe that since we've been successful in one area, that we're now experts in every area. So you'll have somebody and they'll think, because I was successful in whatever it was, because I was successful in business, that automatically means that I'm an expert in politics, sports, parenting, religion, law, technology, infectious diseases, education, global affairs, warfare, the economy, and anything else that you want to talk about. And not only am I an expert in all those areas, I'm also good looking, highly intelligent, and people like me. That's kind of the way, it's hard, it's crazy how it works. But like the smallest taste of success can go to our heads and give us this inflated view of how important, how intelligent, and even how popular we are. Now, there's one more that he mentions, and this is the one I wanted to get to. That's a false sense of security. So a few months ago, I told you we were getting ready for this series. I sent out some random text messages, 25 different people, and I said, what are some things that people spend their lives chasing after? And one of the things that came up over and over again was the answer, a sense of security. Now, right now, we find ourselves living in a world that's just defined by insecurity. So jobs come and go, people come and go, stock market goes up, stock market goes down, Kentucky's football team goes up, and then I'm sorry, but I can't help it. They go down. Prices go up, and they don't come down, but you get the point. I mean, everywhere you look, there's an underlying sense of insecurity. So people are looking for something that will provide them with some sense of security. And most of the time, the first place we look is our bank account, our 401k, retirement account, how many acres we own, the bottom line on our business, how much stuff we have. It's usually some measure of our wealth. And the temptation is to think that if we have more than enough, then we're secure. But if we feel like we have less than enough, then we start to feel the weight of that insecurity. Make sure you understand, that's exactly what Paul was warning against in verse 17. When he says, command those who are rich in this present world. So who's he talking about? He's talking about us. We're the rich people. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, not to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. So why is wealth so uncertain? It's because it can be lost. You already know that. That's why you spend so much time trying to keep from losing what you already have. It's also why you work so hard to get more. It's because deep down inside, no matter how much you have, it can all disappear. I read a stat this week. Did you know that according to the NFL Players Association, 78% of NFL players are bankrupt within 2 years after their last game? NBA, it's a little bit better, but even then, 60% of NBA players are bankrupt within 5 years of their retirement. And then there's this one. According to the National Endowment for Financial Education, just over 70% of the people who win the lottery wind up bankrupt and in worse financial condition than before they won within just 5 short years. Now, when I asked why that happens, one financial advisor explained it this way. He said, people who were ordinary people in their minds all of a sudden become extraordinary. They're euphoric. They lose all sense of reality. They think because they've got money, they're invincible and powerful. They think they're Superman until they find out they're not. Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, said it like this, Proverbs 18. He said, the wealth of the rich is their fortified city. They imagine it a wall too high to scale. And the key word there is imagine. Think I got more than enough? Feel pretty good. It's like I built this wall around me and nothing could get to me, but you need to understand it is an imaginary wall. It does not really exist. This past week, I went down the rabbit hole about why people who win the lottery go bankrupt within 5 years. I started reading about that. And when you think about the amount of money that some people win, it's hard to imagine that you could spend that much. But one of the things I didn't mention is that according to all the research I looked at, the more money a person wins, the more likely they are to go bankrupt, which is the opposite of what most of us would assume. So, for example, I saw a lady on the news this past week in New Jersey. She won $400 million in the lottery last Tuesday. And according to now you hear that $400 million thing. How do you spend $400 million? Some of you are thinking, I don't know, but I'd give it a shot. You know what I mean? But here's a lady, $400 million, and according to all the research, she is more likely to go bankrupt than somebody who won just $4 million. It's weird how it works. And according to experts, there's several different reasons for that. They say the same factors can also come into play for somebody who inherits a large sum of money. So, I've never had to worry about that, but maybe you do, so maybe you want to write these down. There's 3 reasons. Number 1, they spend too much money on what are called depreciating assets. So they go out and they buy cars and houses and clothes and expensive trips, and the money just sort of flies away. The second thing they do, and you know this, is it says they can give too much money away. It's like they've got a little money, so everybody they ever knew, every long-lost cousin, everybody they went to second grade with shows up asking for a handout. The third thing that happens, though, and the one that, according to experts, is the larger problem, is that lottery winners, and even some people on the receiving end of a large inheritance, tend to make a lot of really bad investments. So they invest with people they don't know, in businesses they don't understand, and they take risk that they're not even fully aware of. And what winds up happening is that rather than making more money, they wind up losing what they started with and usually wind up in worse financial shape. So as you can imagine, there's been a lot of research done on this. And do you know why? Do you know why lottery winners have a tendency to make really bad investments? It's because they start to believe that because they're rich, they're also smart. And all of a sudden, what I didn't understand before, because I've got money, now I think I understand it. One researcher said it this way: just because they now have a significant amount of money doesn't mean that they automatically become a sophisticated investor. It's true. So what causes us to think that way? It's the side effects of wealth. It's greed, it's distractions, it's arrogance, and it's a false sense of security. Proverbs 23, Solomon said it this way: do not wear yourself out to get rich. Do not trust your own cleverness. Cast but a glance at riches, and they are gone. For they will surely sprout wings and fly off to the sky like an eagle. So how do you keep that from? How do you guard against it? How do you keep the side effects from ruining your life? Some people read these verses, and here's what they say. It's okay, here's what we need to do. Let's all go home, sell all our stuff, give all our money away, take a vow of poverty, and we'll just struggle to make ends meet for the rest of our lives. But please understand, that's not what Paul said. Nowhere in this passage did Paul say that you need to divest yourself of your wealth. Instead, he says something else about how to move forward. And you see it. I want you to go back with me to verse 17. Here's what he says. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Now check out this part. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Make sure you understand. Paul doesn't say there's anything wrong with enjoying what you have. God's not against you owning a nice house, wearing nice clothes, going on a nice trip. That's not his thing. If you go back in the Old Testament, some of the people that we look to as the heroes of the faith were extremely wealthy. So there's nothing in the Bible that says having money or having wealth or being successful is inherently evil. But it does say that it can be dangerous. And so Paul gives us the antidote to the potential destructive side effects. And here it is. The antidote is to pursue a life of generosity. Most of us pursue a life of getting more. But Paul says what you need to do is take what you have and then pursue a life of generosity. So if you ever find yourself in a position where you have more than enough, Paul says there's 3 things you need to focus on: good deeds, generosity, and being willing to share. And that's the plan, because every time you do something for somebody else, you're reminding yourself that there's more to life, than account numbers and balance sheets and interest rates. And every time you voluntarily give money away, you're breaking the grip of greed on your heart. And every time you share something with somebody else, it's a subtle but powerful reminder that people are more important than possessions. But here's the deal. Some of us hear that, and we automatically start thinking, I'd love to be more generous if I just had more. See, some of us have convinced ourselves that until we have whatever it is we're chasing after, that we can't really afford to be generous. So with that in mind, I want to circle back to something that Paul said in verse 8. We're going to put it on the screen because I want everybody to see it. Here's what he said. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Now here's what we did. We take that verse and we add a bunch of stuff on the end of it. If we have food and clothing and the latest iPhone and a car that's no more than 3 years old and high-speed internet, and a closet full of new outfits, and a flat-screen TV where I can watch all my favorite shows, and a Netflix account, and a retirement account that's fully funded. If we have those things, then we'll be content with that. But what if it wasn't that way? What if we came to a point where we really could be content with what we needed and not just everything that we wanted? I have a picture I want to show you. The man you see on the screen is Yvon Chouinard. He's a famous rock climber. Back in 1973, founded a clothing company called Patagonia. Since then, the company's grown to the point where it now generates revenue over $100 million a year. It's worth estimated north of $3 billion. Huge, huge company. You might have seen Mr. Chouinard and his family on the news last month as it was announced that he and his wife and his 2 children had transferred the ownership of their company to a nonprofit organization that's focused on fighting climate change. That's something that's really important to them, and so they transferred the ownership of their country. Financial analysts were shocked by this move because just a couple months before that, there had been a rumor that the company would be for sale, maybe even go public. People could buy shares, and it would make his family an enormous amount of money. But they chose not to go that route, and they voluntarily, essentially, gave away their company. The company itself will continue to operate. It's just that he and his kids will have no ownership stakes at all. According to one article I read, unlike some other billionaires who have given away lots of money, the Chouinard family no longer has literally zero ownership stake. They don't own any part of the company, and so all the profits the company makes in the future will go to somebody else besides them. The other thing that happened is that rather than getting a huge tax break, they actually wound up paying a huge amount in taxes because of the way they did it, which is really, really unusual. But the people who know Mr. Chouinard said that kind of fits with what they know about him. The New York Times described him as a reluctant billionaire and said even today he wears raggedy old clothes, drives a beat-up Subaru, and splits his time between modest homes in Ventura, California, and Jackson, Wyoming. He also does not own a computer or a cell phone. When a reporter asked him how much money he and his wife had left, I want you to listen to his response. He said, my wife and I have enough to live comfortably. Now, from one angle, hard to imagine. A guy spends 50 years building up this huge empire. I mean, billions of dollars at stakes, and he voluntarily gives it all away. But from another angle, it makes perfect sense when you realize that for this guy and his family, there's something that's more important to them than just having more. There's something they believe in that's more important than just getting more. One writer explained it this way. This was a meaningful cost to them, but it was a cost they were willing to bear to ensure that the company stays true to their principles. Something more important than just more. Now, what about you? What would you do if today you found out you were actually rich? Where would you go? Who would you tell? What would you give away? See, Paul says in this passage, there's really only one investment that's eternal. There's a lot of things you can give to. There's a lot of different places you can give money to, but there's really only one investment that's eternal. And he says when it's all said and done and the story of your life comes to an end, the Bible's clear that everything you have is going to be left behind. When Rockefeller died, somebody asked his assistant, said, how much did he leave behind? And his assistant quickly said, he left all of it behind. Because that's what we do. The only exception to that is what you give away. Because Paul says it's what you give away, that as you give it away, you're laying for yourself a firm foundation, not just for this life, but for the life to come. I want you to stand with me. The band's going to come. And as we close today, I want you just to ask yourself a couple questions. I want you to ask yourself, have I been investing my life in the right things, or have I been distracted with less important things? Or maybe you need to ask yourself, have I put my trust in Christ, or am I putting my trust in a bunch of stuff and a bunch of money to provide for me a sense of security that it can never truly provide? So whatever your answers are to those questions, if you feel like you need to pray with somebody, if you feel like you want to talk to somebody, Dave and I will be here. If you feel like, hey, I got questions about this, we're here. We'd be glad to talk with you. We'd be glad to pray with you. Maybe you want to grab us after the service, whatever you're comfortable with. Or maybe you're here and you say, I want to join the team. Last week you had some folks place their membership here. If that's you and you say, I'm ready to join the family, we'd be honored to talk with you. But if you need to talk to one of us, you just meet us here.